Have you ever stopped to think if we're truly evolving as a society? While we celebrate each new technology, each scientific advance, over a century ago, a man dared to question this fundamental belief. Leo Tolstoy, the giant of Russian literature, saw beyond appearances and discovered a disturbing truth. He realized that behind all this race for progress exists a great lie, an illusion that makes us believe we're improving when, in reality, we're moving away from what truly matters. Could he have been right? This text explores how the thinker unmasked this farce and why his ideas are more current than ever. Prepare to question everything you believe about the modern world. At the end of the 19th century, when the world was celebrating the marvels of the Industrial Revolution, Tolstoy observed with critical eyes. He saw factories sprouting like mushrooms after rain, cities growing uncontrollably, and machines revolutionizing human life. But where others saw progress, he saw a dangerous trap. Humanity was trading its essence for a superficial shine that promised happiness but delivered only emptiness. The Russian writer perceived something that even today few can see. There's a fundamental difference between technical progress and moral progress. We can invent incredible machines and connect the entire world, but that doesn't make us better people. It doesn't teach us to love more or live in peace. In fact, it often distances us from these essential virtues. The great illusion of modernity is believing that improving our material conditions automatically improves our spiritual conditions. As he himself wrote, "Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself." This phrase perfectly summarizes his critique of modernity. The more society developed technically, the more people became unhappy and disconnected from one another. What made this observation even more impressive was the historical context in which he lived. 19th century Russia was undergoing dramatic transformations. The abolition of serfdom in 1861 had freed millions of peasants, but many ended up in worse situations than before. Industrialization was arriving with force, promising to modernize a still medieval country. He witnessed these changes up close. As a rural landowner and member of the nobility, he had privileged access to circles of power, but also maintained direct contact with the peasants on his lands. This unique position allowed him to see both sides of the coin of progress. This shocking discovery was based on concrete observations of reality. Far from being a theorist isolated in his ivory tower, he walked the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg, talked with ordinary people, and saw how modernization was transforming Russian society. What he witnessed left him deeply disturbed. The factories that sprouted everywhere weren't temples of progress as proclaimed by enthusiasts of modernity. They were true prisons that dehumanized workers, transforming unique human beings into replaceable parts of a gigantic and cold machine. Men and women who had previously lived connected to the land, following natural cycles and maintaining millennia-old traditions, now became numbers on a payroll. They lost their individuality, creativity, and dignity in the name of an efficiency that benefited only factory owners. He observed how the industrial work rhythm went against human nature. Before, a craftsman controlled the entire process of creating an object. He chose materials, applied his technique, and saw the final result. There was pride and satisfaction in that work. In factories, each worker did only a small part, repeating the same movement hundreds of times per day. In industrial cities, he witnessed lost crowds living crammed together in miserable conditions. They breathed air polluted by smokestacks that vomited toxic smoke day and night, and lost contact with the nature that had previously nourished their souls. Urban progress created an artificial environment that suffocated the human soul. Worker housing consisted of true overcrowded tenements where entire families shared a single room. The lack of basic sanitation created unsanitary conditions that facilitated the spread of diseases. The constant noise of machines and the smell of smokestacks created an oppressive environment that affected both body and spirit. Meanwhile, rural life still kept people connected to natural rhythms deeply rooted in human experience. Work in the fields had real and visible meaning. Planting a seed, caring for its growth, and harvesting the fruit was a complete cycle that nourished both body and spirit. In cities, this cycle broke completely, leaving people without clear purpose for their lives. He also noticed how urbanization changed social relations. In the countryside, people had known each other for generations. There existed a network of mutual support based on trust and solidarity. In cities, people became strangers to one another, creating a loneliness amid the crowd that he considered one of modernity's greatest tragedies. But was the problem only in the factories? The philosopher realized that the root was much deeper. The modern educational system itself was serving the interests of this false modernity, creating a generation of people disconnected from their essential humanity. The schools that emerged everywhere didn't truly educate children for a full and meaningful life. On the contrary, they functioned as factories specialized in producing obedient workers and passive consumers to feed the industrial machine. Formal education was obsessively concerned with transmitting fragmented technical information, but completely uninterested in developing fundamental human qualities like wisdom, compassion, and critical thinking. The emerging traditional education artificially separated abstract knowledge from concrete practical life. Children spent years learning about the world through dusty books and theories, disconnected from reality, but completely lost direct contact with lived experience. It was as if they were being prepared to live in a paper world, not the real world. The thinker observed that children educated in the formal system lost their natural curiosity and ability to question. They were trained to accept authorities without questioning and to value book learning above practical experience. This created adults who knew much about theories, but little about real life. He passionately defended a natural and organic education, where children would learn through manual work, careful observation of nature, and active participation in community life. He believed children learn best when knowledge is connected to their direct experiences and when they can see the practical application of what they're learning. To test his educational theories in practice, he established a revolutionary experimental school on his Yasnaya Polyana estate, where poor peasant children learned in a completely free and spontaneous way. There were no humiliating punishments, artificially imposed rigid schedules, or mandatory curriculum determined by distant bureaucrats. Children learned because they genuinely wanted to learn, motivated by the natural curiosity that every human being possesses from birth. He discovered that when children aren't forced to learn, they naturally seek knowledge about subjects that interest them and learn much more quickly. The results were impressive and challenged all assumptions of formal education. These children developed creativity, independent thinking, and practical skills far superior to students in traditional schools. They also maintained their natural joy of living and their capacity to relate authentically with other people. The author proved in practice that there exists a radically better way to educate, a way that respects human nature instead of trying to mold it according to the needs of the industrial system. His school became a model for progressive educators around the world. This fundamental critique of education naturally extended to the world of art and culture in general. He observed with growing indignation how art had become the exclusive privilege of a rich and completely idle elite. Sophisticated music, elaborate paintings, and complex literature were created specifically to impress and entertain a small group of highly educated people, while the great mass of the population was completely excluded from this cultural production. True art should unite people, not separate them, he said with conviction. For him, art should be naturally accessible to all people, regardless of their social class or educational level, and should morally elevate people, bringing them closer to universal values like unconditional love and social justice. Art shouldn't serve merely as superficial entertainment for bored rich people, or as empty demonstration of elitist cultural refinement. It had a profound social responsibility to connect all human beings through shared emotional experiences and bring them closer to universal values that transcend artificial barriers. A true work of art should touch the heart of a simple peasant in the same way it moved a cultured aristocrat. If a work of art couldn't communicate with ordinary people, then it wasn't truly art, but merely disguised intellectual exhibitionism. He developed a revolutionary aesthetic theory based on the idea that art should be a means of communication between human souls. Art's function wasn't to impress with technique or complexity, but to transmit genuine feelings from one person to another, creating authentic human connections. Consistent with this artistic philosophy, he radically modified his own literary style after these fundamental discoveries. He deliberately abandoned the elaborate technical complexity that characterized his early novels and began writing in a simpler, more direct and accessible way. He desperately wanted his works to be understood and appreciated by peasants and common workers, not just by sophisticated intellectuals who frequented elegant salons. This change didn't represent a diminution of literary quality, but an evolution toward a more genuine and human form of art. But his attack on modernity didn't stop there. He identified another serious problem that few of his contemporaries could perceive: the false science of positivism that was dominating the academic thought of the time. Modern science, with its almost religious obsession with precise measurements and controlled experiments, was completely losing sight of the most important and urgent questions of human existence. Scientists could explain in detail how the most complex machines worked, but were completely incapable of answering why life is worth living. The emerging scientism created the dangerous illusion that only what can be mathematically measured and numerically quantified possesses real value in the world. Deep feelings, fundamental moral values, and transformative spiritual experiences were systematically discarded as primitive superstitions of the past that should be eliminated by scientific reason. But he knew intuitively that these intangible dimensions of human experience are exactly the most important for a full and meaningful life. As he observed, science without conscience is merely ruin of the soul. The obsessive overvaluation of technical reason was rapidly creating a strange world where people knew more and more details about things that were less and less important for their happiness and personal fulfillment. Highly trained specialists emerged in very specific and limited technical areas, but completely lost the integrated vision of the whole of human life. Ancient wisdom, which harmoniously integrated knowledge and practical life, was being brutally replaced by fragmented information completely useless for genuine human happiness. Knowledge was becoming an accumulation of disconnected facts instead of a deep understanding of life. He realized that this fragmentation of knowledge reflected a broader fragmentation of human experience. People were losing the ability to see connections between different aspects of life and to understand the broader meaning of their experiences. This devastating analysis of modern science connected directly with his even more fundamental discovery about the corrosive effects of private property on society. He identified the extreme concentration of wealth in the hands of a few privileged as the poisoned root of practically all the social evils he observed around him. While some individuals accumulated literally immense fortunes, the overwhelming majority of the population lived in the most degrading poverty and constant insecurity. This shocking inequality wasn't simply an unfortunate but temporary side effect of progress that would be corrected with time. It was, in reality, the absolutely inevitable and necessary consequence of a system based on private accumulation of capital. Modern economic progress structurally depended on the systematic exploitation of the weakest by the strongest. Private ownership of land was especially problematic and unjust in his view. Land, like the air we breathe and the water we drink, shouldn't belong to anyone as exclusive possession. It was a natural resource that should be freely available to all people who were willing to work it with their own hands. The artificial monopolization of land by large landowners forced peasants to become dependent wage workers or to desperately migrate to overcrowded cities. This created an army of landless people who were forced to sell their labor power to survive. He observed how private property created unjust power relations where a few controlled the resources necessary for life, while the majority depended on the goodwill of these owners to have access to work and means of subsistence. He courageously proposed a completely radical social reorganization based on cooperative community life and mutually beneficial work. People should live in small, self-sufficient agricultural communities, where each member would voluntarily contribute their work according to their capacities and generously receive according to their real needs. There would be no individual accumulation of wealth nor systematic exploitation of other people's work. Everyone would work together for the common good, sharing both the responsibilities and benefits of their collective labor. This vision wasn't utopian or unrealistic. He based his proposals on observation of traditional rural communities that still maintained forms of cooperation and mutual aid. He saw that it was possible to organize society in a more just and human way. This alternative economic vision was solidly founded on his even more radical critique of the modern state as an institution. For the thinker, the state was fundamentally a violent organization that existed primarily to protect and perpetuate the unjust privileges of the rich against the legitimate demands of the poor. The state is organized violence, he declared without beating around the bush. Powerful armies, repressive police forces, and biased courts served exclusively to maintain a deeply unjust system through the systematic application of brute force. The modern state hypocritically presented itself as a benevolent protector of social order and civilization, but in concrete reality was the main structural obstacle to establishing a truly just and harmonious society. Its elaborate laws primarily defended the private property of the rich. Its armed forces protected completely artificial borders, and its complex bureaucracy created unnecessary barriers between people. All this was maintained through the constant threat of violence against those who refused to obey. He gradually developed a deeply original Christian anarchist vision that categorically rejected every form of externally imposed coercive authority. People should organize themselves completely through voluntary initiative, basing their relations on mutual love and genuine cooperation, never on paralyzing fear and forced obedience. True historical progress would be the progressive elimination of all social institutions that structurally depend on violence to function. This included not only the state, but also all forms of authority that are based on coercion instead of free consent. This implacable critique of state power logically extended to official religious institutions that servilely collaborated with the government. He observed with growing horror how the Russian Orthodox Church had become completely corrupted by allying itself with the autocratic state. Instead of courageously preaching the unconditional love and universal compassion originally taught by Christ, it regularly blessed brutal wars and religiously legitimized the systematic oppression of the poor. The Church had become a tool of political power instead of a force for spiritual transformation. Institutionalized religion had completely betrayed its original spiritual mission and transformed into yet another sophisticated instrument of social control. Empty and pompous rituals replaced sincere search for genuine inner transformation. Complex and incomprehensible theological dogmas deliberately distanced people from the simple and direct message of universal love that constituted the essence of all great spiritual teachings. Official religion created mysteries where there should be clarity and divisions, where there should be union. He desperately sought a pure and authentic Christianity, completely stripped of all institutional pomp and clerical hierarchy. He studied the original Gospels directly with a scholar's dedication and extracted from them a practical philosophy of life based on absolute non-violence, voluntary simplicity, and dedicated service to others. His religiosity was intensely practical and concrete, not merely theoretical or intellectual. For him, true religion wasn't in rituals or dogmas, but in how a person lived their daily life. Authentic spirituality manifested through concrete actions of love and service. This authentic and transformative spirituality led him to a radical and dramatic change in his own personal life. He courageously abandoned all the luxuries and privileges of his aristocratic social position and began living deliberately, simply, and modestly. He worked daily on the land with his own hands, wore rustic clothes identical to those of peasants, and generously distributed his considerable inherited wealth to needy people. This transformation wasn't easy and caused conflicts in his family, but he considered it necessary to live with integrity. "I cannot preach what I don't practice," he said with sincerity. The conscious return to simple life didn't represent romantic nostalgia for the past or irresponsible escapism from modern reality. It was a practical and moral necessity that couldn't be postponed for anyone who wanted to live coherently according to their deepest values. He clearly realized that it was completely impossible to sincerely preach social justice while continuing to live as a privileged aristocrat. Authentic social transformation should necessarily begin with radical personal transformation. As he observed, "Be the change you want to see in the world." He especially valued honest manual work, which kept people solidly connected to the concrete reality of the physical world and to their own natural creative capacity. Working the land directly, building houses with one's own hands, or making clothes was infinitely more dignified and satisfying for the human soul than any abstract intellectual activity disconnected from real life. Physical work kept people naturally humble and intimately connected to the fundamental needs of human existence. It also provided the satisfaction of creating something concrete and useful, in contrast to many modern activities that produce only abstractions. He noticed that people who work with their hands tend to be more realistic and practical in their approach to life. They don't get lost in complicated theories because they're constantly testing their ideas against the concrete reality of the physical world. This practical philosophy of simple living contrasted dramatically with the emerging consumerism of modern bourgeois society. While modernity obsessively encouraged the accumulation of material goods as the main sign of success and personal fulfillment, he courageously preached the deliberate reduction of needs as the only true path to human freedom. A person who needs very little doesn't depend on anyone and can't be easily controlled or manipulated. Voluntary simplicity frees people from the tyranny of constant consumption and allows them to focus on what really matters in life. He discovered that the less he possessed, the freer he felt. The reduction of material needs created space for spiritual growth and for more authentic relationships with other people. The most revolutionary and transformative aspect of his thinking was his absolutely radical defense of nonviolence as a fundamental principle of life. He identified violence as the basic mechanism that sustained the entire unjust system he criticized so ferociously. Governments depended on armies to impose their will. Landowners depended on coercive laws to protect their possessions, and businessmen depended on aggressive competition to eliminate rivals. Definitively breaking this vicious cycle of violence was absolutely essential to create a genuinely just society. Violence generates violence, he observed with profound wisdom. Using violent means to achieve supposedly just ends inevitably corrupted and destroyed those noble ends. Violence always generates more violence, creating an infinite and destructive cycle of retaliation and suffering that perpetuates through generations. Non-violence wasn't merely a convenient political tactic that could be abandoned when it didn't work adequately. It was an absolute moral principle that admitted no exceptions or compromises. He believed that moral coherence required the complete rejection of all violent methods. Passive resistance was the most effective and morally superior way to combat systematic injustice. Courageously refusing to participate in oppressive systems, consciously disobeying unjust laws, and dignifiedly accepting the consequences had infinitely more transformative power than any armed revolution. This strategy of nonviolent resistance required much greater moral courage than physical violence, which frequently serves as a cowardly escape for frustration. It required great inner strength to maintain non-violence even in the face of provocation and persecution. He developed a complete philosophy of non-violent resistance that included elements like civil disobedience, non-cooperation with unjust systems, and willingness to personally suffer for one's own convictions. He saw this as the highest form of political action. These revolutionary ideas about non-violence profoundly and lastingly influenced liberation movements around the entire world. Mahatma Gandhi, who managed to free India from British colonial rule through organized peaceful resistance, publicly recognized Tolstoy as his main spiritual inspirer and intellectual mentor. The moving letters exchanged between the two spiritual giants clearly show how the Russian writer's thinking decisively shaped the Indian leader's strategy. Gandhi called Tolstoy the greatest apostle of non-violence that the present age has produced. Martin Luther King Jr. also consciously applied Tolstoyan principles in the historic struggle for civil rights in the United States. The American Black movement achieved profound and lasting social transformations without resorting to destructive violence, demonstrating unequivocally in concrete practice the superior effectiveness of ideas about non-violent resistance. He understood his own monumental literary work as a completely inseparable part of his broader social mission. His epic novels weren't simply sophisticated entertainment for cultured readers, but carefully crafted tools to awaken people's dormant consciousness about the urgent problems of his time. War and Peace and Anna Karenina implacably revealed how aristocratic society was completely empty and morally corrupted inside, despite its brilliant and sophisticated appearances. Through engaging narratives, he showed the contradictions and hypocrisies of the Russian elite. Through his complex and convincing characters, he methodically explored the devastating psychological consequences and terrible moral costs of modern life. He showed with surgical precision how the obsessive pursuit of social prestige, money, and power left people deeply unhappy and completely alienated from themselves. His most admirable heroes were invariably those who courageously chose authentic simplicity and genuine life instead of the false rewards offered by modern society. Characters like Konstantin Levine in Anna Karenina represented the search for a more authentic and meaningful life. His literature had an absolutely clear and conscious pedagogical function: to patiently teach readers that there exists a radically better way to live, not through tedious and authoritarian moralistic preaching, but by showing real and convincing characters facing universal moral dilemmas with which any reader can identify. His books functioned as safe laboratories for moral experiments where readers could learn valuable lessons about life without having to personally pay the painful price of mistakes. Literature became a form of moral education through vicarious experience. He also saw with prophetic clarity how emerging capitalism was creating completely new types of exploitation and human alienation. The modern industrial system systematically transformed workers into easily replaceable parts of a gigantic and impersonal social machine. People progressively lost all control over their own work and became completely dependent on wages paid by employers they didn't even know personally and who didn't care at all about their well-being. Work became a curse instead of a source of fulfillment. Unbridled capitalist competition deliberately encouraged the worst instincts of human nature: insatiable greed, destructive selfishness, and cruel indifference to others' suffering. Instead of promoting constructive cooperation and human solidarity, the capitalist system systematically promoted the war of all against all. The weakest were mercilessly crushed by the strongest, creating a deeply unjust and dehumanized society. Social Darwinism became the dominant ideology, justifying exploitation as natural law. He courageously proposed radical economic alternatives based on voluntary cooperation and real social justice. Completely self-sufficient agricultural communities where people would work together harmoniously and equitably divide the fruits of their common labor. Small artisan workshops where each worker would have creative control over the entire production process, recovering the dignity and satisfaction of work. Direct exchange systems that would completely eliminate the corrupting mediation of money and private profit. These proposals weren't mere utopian fantasies, but practical plans based on observation of communities that already functioned according to these principles. He saw that it was possible to organize the economy in a more human and just way. His tireless spiritual search led him far beyond the narrow limits of official and institutional Christianity. He intensively studied Eastern religions, especially Buddhism and Hinduism, finding in them precious elements that profoundly enriched his understanding of spiritual life. He discovered fundamental universal truths in all the great religious traditions of humanity, transcending superficial cultural barriers, unconditional compassion for suffering beings, tireless search for inner truth, and gradual transcendence of destructive egoism were themes common to all authentic traditions. This spiritual openness wasn't superficial or eclectic, but represented a sincere search for the essential elements that all authentic religions share. He masterfully managed to synthesize Eastern and Western spiritual teachings into a perfectly coherent and intensely practical philosophy of life. His reading of the Tao Te Ching, the Upanishads, and Buddhist texts convinced him that there exists a universal wisdom that transcends cultural and historical differences. This perennial wisdom speaks directly to the human heart in all epochs and places. His spiritual influence extended far beyond the limits of literature and reached sincere seekers throughout the world. He maintained regular correspondence with spiritually oriented people from all continents and received visitors at his estate who came seeking guidance and inspiration. He became a kind of informal guru for countless people who courageously questioned the materialist values of modern society. His house at Yasnaya Polyana transformed into a pilgrimage center for spiritual seekers from around the world. The lasting global influence of the thinker eloquently demonstrates how his revolutionary ideas transcended cultural and historical boundaries. Gandhi brilliantly applied Tolstoyan non-violence in the anti-colonial struggle that liberated India from British rule. Martin Luther King used the same fundamental principles in the civil rights struggle that transformed the United States. Pacifist movements throughout the world continue to be inspired by his transformative philosophy, from the student protests of the 1960s to contemporary environmental movements. To this day, alternative communities scattered across all continents courageously attempt to implement the ideals of simple living and voluntary cooperation. Sustainable eco-villages, ecological agricultural communities, and voluntary simplicity movements clearly bear the indelible mark of his visionary thinking. His prophetic critique of materialist consumerism resonates with special force in an era of unprecedented global environmental crisis. Ideas about voluntary simplicity and sustainable living offer practical alternatives to the development model based on infinite growth. Contemporary activists constantly rediscover valuable and timeless tools to face today's urgent challenges. His devastating critique of purely technological progress is especially relevant in an era dominated by manipulative social media, potentially dangerous artificial intelligence, and invasive digital surveillance. He anticipated with impressive precision many of the most serious problems we face today: digital alienation, loss of privacy, manipulation of public opinion through technology, and growing social inequality exacerbated by automation. The most impressive and prophetic aspect of his thinking was his ability to predict exactly where the modern obsession with uncontrolled material progress would lead. He anticipated the global ecological crisis by realizing that the industrial system criminally treats nature as an infinite resource to be exploited without limits. He predicted how extreme concentration of wealth would create explosive social inequalities that would threaten the stability of all civilization. He anticipated how technology would be used to control and manipulate the masses instead of liberating them. He understood with scientific precision that the artificial separation between humanity and nature would inevitably lead to catastrophic consequences. His passionate defense of rural life was simultaneously a visionary defense of environmental sustainability long before this concept existed. He knew intuitively that a civilization that declares war on nature is doomed to self-destruction. The unbridled exploitation of natural resources and industrial pollution would lead to an ecological collapse that would threaten human survival itself. His vision of alienated work is dramatically confirmed in the digital age. Millions of people spend their lives doing work they consider completely meaningless, just to earn enough money to consume products they don't really need. The critique of industrial work applies perfectly to modern office work. The manipulation of masses through media was also anticipated with impressive precision. He saw how elites would use education and culture to shape people's minds according to their interests. His critique of elitist art included a prophetic concern with the use of culture as a sophisticated instrument of domination. More than a century after his death, he continues to be a powerful prophetic voice that tirelessly warns us about the deadly dangers of confusing technical progress with authentic human progress. His message is simple, but absolutely revolutionary. Genuine happiness doesn't come from having more material things, but from becoming a morally better and spiritually more developed person. In a world completely obsessed with speed, efficiency, and infinite economic growth, he patiently reminds us that another possible path exists. A path based on voluntary simplicity, universal compassion, and genuine connection between all people. The fundamental questions he asked more than 100 years ago remain dramatically unanswered. Are we truly progressing as human beings, or just frantically moving in circles? Have our technical achievements made us happier or more lost? Perhaps it's urgently necessary to stop this crazy race for progress and finally seek true wisdom. As he said, everyone wants to change the world, but no one wants to change himself. How about we start with ourselves? The transformation of the world begins with the inner transformation of each individual. Only transformed people can create a truly transformed society.